On the morning of September 14, 1858, the bells of St. Bartholomew Chapel rang over St. Martin Parish, Louisiana, as if heaven itself had agreed to bless what men had arranged in secret. The guests arrived in polished carriages. The women stepped carefully through the chapel yard in silk and mourning lace, though no death had yet been announced. The men stood in black coats under the cypress shade, speaking in low voices about cotton prices, sugar contracts, and the old dispute between the Ashcroft and Mercer estates. They spoke of marriage the way merchants speak of shipping routes, calmly, practically, without shame. At the center of it stood Father Elias Vane, age 56, a priest praised for his discipline, his polished sermons, and his supposed moral steadiness. Parish records described him as a guardian of order. The wealthy called him wise. The poor called him untouchable. The enslaved, when they dared to speak at all, called him something colder, a man who could wash a crime in holy words and leave no stain where white eyes could see it. That morning, Father Vane prepared to marry Miss Eleanor Ashcroft, 19 years old, the only legitimate daughter of the late Colonel Nathaniel Ashcroft, to Julian Mercer, 21, heir to the Mercer holdings upriver. The union had been announced as a reconciliation between two houses that had spent nearly 12 years tearing at each other through lawsuits, debt claims, and contested land boundaries. In public, it was called peace. In private, it was called necessity. The Ashcrofts needed stability. The Mercers needed access. Between them stood land, mills, labor, and cash flow built on the backs of black bodies that neither family intended to free. And so the marriage was dressed as virtue. That is how corruption often survives in respectable places. It does not arrive screaming. It arrives pressed, perfumed, and carrying a Bible. Eleanor Ashcroft entered the chapel just before noon, pale but composed, one gloved hand resting on the arm of her aunt, Mrs. Beatrice Wren. Witnesses later recalled that she looked less like a bride than a daughter obeying orders too large for her to refuse. She wore ivory satin brought from New Orleans in August, with a lace veil pinned carefully over dark hair. She had been taught what many daughters of powerful houses were taught in that century, not to question arrangements made by men, not to inspect the machinery of family honor, and never to ask what price had been paid before her comfort was secured. At the altar waited Julian Mercer. He stood straight, well-dressed, controlled, clean-shaven except for a faint shadow at the jaw, a young man trained to occupy a room without trembling. But there was something in his face that did not belong fully to the Mercer line. The mouth was too severe, the brow too familiar. The eyes, gray under the chapel light, carried a hardness that did not come from Edmund Mercer's side of the family. Those details would matter before the hour was over. Small things become devastating when truth finally has the courage to stand beside them. The pews were full. Planters, lawyers, parish officials, women who had watched enslaved girls grow into silence, men who spoke of Christian duty while calculating yield per acre, all of them ready to witness a union said to be proper, lawful, and blessed. Then the chapel door opened. Not with force, not with theatrical noise. It opened the way old grief opens, slowly and too late for comfort. An elderly black woman stepped inside, bent by years, wearing a faded brown dress roughened by travel and labor. Her shawl was threadbare. Her hands were scarred. Her face carried that particular look seen in those who have been forced to outlive too much. She was recognized by almost no one at first. Why would they recognize her? Men like the Ashcrofts had spent decades depending on the belief that those they sold, whipped, or cast out would vanish into history without a voice. But her name was Dinah Reed, and she had not come back to beg. She stopped halfway down the aisle. Her breathing was shallow from the journey, but her eyes were sharp. She looked first at the altar, then at Julian Mercer, and the chapel seemed to narrow around that single glance. It was not the look of confusion. It was recognition. Immediate, mortal, damning. There are moments when a lie begins to die before a single word is spoken. This was one of them. Several guests turned in annoyance. One usher moved toward her. Mrs. Beatrice Wren was the first to whisper her name aloud, and even then she did so with disgust, not alarm. Dinah Reed had once belonged to the Ashcroft property, sold away in 1842, after what family papers called household disruption. That phrase deserves to be remembered for what it is, the language of cowards. In plantation records, crime was often renamed inconvenience. Assault became indiscretion. Sale became transfer. A mother's disappearance became order restored. Dinah did not bow. She did not remove herself. She fixed her eyes on Julian and said, in a voice cracked by age but not by fear, "That man is not a mercer." Silence struck the room harder than thunder. Father Elias Vane stepped forward at once, too quickly for an innocent man. He raised one hand, not in comfort, but in control. He told her this was a sacred ceremony. He told her not to disturb the peace of the church. He told her to leave. That was his first instinct, not to ask why she had spoken, not to test whether her words held truth, not to protect the young woman at the altar. His first instinct was to contain. That should be marked carefully, because guilty men always defend the frame before they defend the people trapped inside it. Dinah did not move. Her gaze stayed on Julian Mercer. She said she had seen his face once before, on a storm-soaked night in April of 1839, inside the chapel house behind St. Bartholomew. She said she knew the shape of his eyes, the line of his mouth, the mark near his left ear. She said she knew because she had held him when he was born. A murmur spread through the pews. Some called her mad, some called her drunk, some simply looked toward Father Vane, waiting for the priest to kill the matter with authority. That is the privilege powerful men rely on, not innocence, but obedience from others too frightened or too invested to ask the next question. Julian Mercer turned then, properly turned, and faced her. Witnesses would later say his expression changed at that moment, not into recognition perhaps. He had been raised under another name. He could not recognize a history buried from infancy, but something in him responded. Confusion, unease. The body sometimes hears truth before the mind can endure it. Eleanor Ashcroft, still standing near the altar rail, looked between them with a face drained of color. No one had prepared her for this. No one ever prepares the innocent when they intend to use them. That is another lesson old as the plantation South. Those sacrificed for family profit are the last to be informed. Father Vane told Dinah Reed she was speaking blasphemy. That word matters too. Blasphemy. Not falsehood, not error. Blasphemy. He tried to make her accusation sound like an offense against God rather than a threat to the arrangement before him. Men who hide behind the church often do this. They drag heaven into their own filth and hope decent people will be too intimidated to separate one from the other. But Dinah Reed had returned too far, suffered too much, and buried too many names to retreat now. She said she had come back because the dead were not being allowed to rest. She said some sins were written not only in ledgers but in blood. She said that before this wedding joined two estates. Someone had better answer what happened in the chapel 19 years earlier, when one child was taken, one child was renamed, and a priest chose silence over righteousness. At that, several men moved toward her, not because she had been disproven, because she had gone too close to the truth. Remember that. Record that. In every age there are crimes so well dressed that people mistake interruption for evil and ceremony for innocence. The wedding had not yet reached the vows, but the blessing was already rotten. And before this day was finished, St. Bartholomew Chapel would no longer be remembered as the place where two noble houses made peace. It would be remembered as the place where an old enslaved mother came back to name the child they stole, and where a priest standing under the cross revealed by his own panic that he had known far more than he ever meant to confess. If you're listening from somewhere in the world, comment your location below. And tell me this. Should a wedding continue once the first witness arrives with blood, memory, and the truth no one wants spoken aloud? The old woman's accusation did not begin in 1858. It began on a night the parish had every reason to bury. That night was April 3, 1839. The storm started before dusk over St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. By midnight, the cypress groves behind St. Bartholomew Chapel were shaking under wind hard enough to bend branches into one another. Rain hit the chapel roof in long, punishing sheets. The yard flooded first, then the narrow path behind the church turned to black mud. No carriage should have been moving in such weather. No respectable visitor should have been out. And yet someone came. That is how these stories often begin. Not with chaos, but with arrangement. Not with accident, but with timing. At the rear of the property behind the chapel itself stood a small brick outbuilding used for storage, temporary lodging, and, when necessary, private confinement. Parish notes called it the chapel house. It had one narrow bed, one iron washstand, one locked cabinet for records, and a side entrance hidden from the main road by trees. Father Elias Vane had been assigned to St. Bartholomew less than a year earlier, in July 1838. He was 40 years old then, already known for discipline, already useful to families who preferred a priest who could keep his mouth shut. That night, there were 3 people inside the chapel house before the worst of the storm broke. The first was Dinah Reed, about 24 years old, enslaved on the Ashcroft property since girlhood. She had been taken there as a child after her mother died in Iberville Parish. By 1839, she was used inside the main house and occasionally sent to the chapel kitchens when the parish expected wealthy visitors. The Ashcrofts called her reliable. Men like them used that word when they meant trapped. Dinah was heavily pregnant by then. Everyone on the Ashcroft estate knew it. No one in that household had bothered to ask publicly who the father was, because some questions in slave country were considered rude only when spoken aloud. The answer was visible to anyone willing to look. Colonel Nathaniel Ashcroft, then 46, widowed for 3 years and still head of the estate, had taken a private interest in her beginning in late summer of 1838. That is the language plantations preferred: interest, attention, familiarity. Not coercion, not violation, not ownership turned into access. Respectable households relied on soft words to cover hard crimes. The second person in the chapel house was Mrs. Hester Bell, a midwife in her late 50s who had delivered both white and black children across the parish for nearly 3 decades. She had a practical face, swollen knuckles, and a reputation for silence. Silence was a skill women like Hester were forced to perfect if they wished to survive among powerful families. She had been summoned after sunset by a messenger from the Ashcroft property and brought in through the back path to avoid notice. Dinah's labor had started early, and Colonel Ashcroft did not want noise reaching the main house. The third was Father Elias Vane. That fact should be held in the light and not allowed to drift away under excuses. He was there. He did not arrive later. He did not hear about it afterward. He was in the building while the labor unfolded. Why was a priest in a chapel outbuilding after midnight, with an enslaved woman in secret labor and a midwife sworn to discretion? Because the child mattered. Because the father mattered. Because the birth itself was not the scandal they feared. The scandal was what the birth could prove. Dinah's pains worsened near 1 in the morning. Hester Bell later told one person, only one, that the child came fast once the bleeding started. The labor was dangerous. Dinah bit down on cloth to keep from crying out. She understood the rules of that place better than anyone. A black woman in pain was expected to be quiet. A black woman carrying the master's child was expected to disappear. And if she lived through it, she was expected to return to work as though no body had been broken and no truth had entered the room. That is what slavery demanded every day, not only labor but the destruction of witness. The boy was born alive. According to the account Dinah would later repeat in 1858, he came just after 1:30 a.m., thin but breathing strongly, with a sharp cry and a small dark mark behind his left ear. Hester wrapped him in plain linen torn from chapel stock. Dinah held him only briefly. She was exhausted, half delirious from blood loss, but she remembered the child's face. Mothers remember under conditions history thinks should erase them. That is one of the many things cruel men never understand until it is too late. The storm outside deepened. Then, before Dinah had even finished bleeding, another arrival came. A carriage. Not to the front of the chapel, where decent business was done, but to the rear path, where shame was handled in private. The horses were covered against the rain. A lantern flashed once through the shutters. Father Vane stepped outside, spoke to someone under the eaves, and returned with water on his coat sleeves and a face already set into calculation. The person brought in was Miss Clara Whitmore, age 17, niece to Judge Augustus Whitmore of New Orleans and distant kin to the Mercer family through her mother's line. She had been traveling upriver when her labor began prematurely. That was the official explanation later whispered in fragments. But even that story was suspicious. Clara Whitmore was unmarried. She had been kept out of public view for weeks before April 1839. Her family did not want a physician in town. They wanted distance, church walls, and a priest willing to manage disgrace without leaving a public mark. So, under one roof during one storm, 2 women labored. One was a white girl from a family with legal influence. The other was an enslaved black woman owned by a man who considered himself untouchable. One child threatened reputation. The other threatened inheritance. In slave society, when 2 threats arrived together, the solution was rarely moral. It was strategic. Clara's labor went badly. By Hester Bell's later account, the second infant, a boy as well, was born weak just before dawn, somewhere near 4 a.m. He had trouble breathing. His skin turned dusky. He barely cried. Hester tried to clear his throat and warm him, but his chest struggled for air. Father Vane stayed close, too close for a man pretending only to administer comfort. He watched not with compassion, but with concern for consequence. The hours between 4 and 5 a.m. are the true grave of this story. No parish ledger records them honestly, no sermon mentions them. No grave marker corrects them, but everything that followed points back there. Dinah said that after dawn's first gray light touched the shutters, her son was taken from beside her bed. She was weak, fevered, unable to rise. She heard Hester object quietly. She heard Father Vane say that certain matters had to be handled for the preservation of order. That phrase should never be trusted when spoken by men guarding wealth. Preservation of order has buried more innocent lives than open violence ever needed to. Dinah asked for her child. No one answered plainly. Then she heard another baby crying. Not the struggling cry from the second bed. A stronger cry. Her child's cry. By the time she was coherent enough to understand what had been done, the linens had changed places, the room had been cleaned, and the naming had already begun. The healthy boy born to Dinah Reed was no longer being treated as Dinah Reed's son. He was being prepared for another life. Whether the dying infant of Clara Whitmore survived for minutes or hours after that remains uncertain. Some later testimony suggested he expired before sunrise. Other whispers claimed he lingered into morning and was buried without a formal entry. What matters is this: after that storm, there was only one living boy that powerful people needed accounted for, and they chose to account for him falsely. This was not charity toward a child. It was theft arranged under the shelter of race. A white family facing scandal needed a healthier infant. A black mother with no legal standing could be stripped of hers. A priest could alter a registry. A midwife could be pressured into silence. A colonel could look the other way, or farther than that, could take part if his own interests required it. These were not unusual mechanisms in the slave South. They were ordinary. That is what makes them monstrous, because evil sustained by custom is harder to uproot than evil committed in panic. Dinah later said she saw Father Vane carry a ledger from the cabinet just after sunrise. She saw him dip the pen. She saw him write. She did not know what name he entered then, only that when she demanded again to see her son, Hester Bell would not meet her eyes. By noon, Dinah had been told the child was dead. She was not shown a body long enough to verify it. She was told to pray. She was told to accept God's will. The same men who had rearranged her suffering now instructed her to sanctify it. Remember that pattern. First they injure, then they rename, then they preach submission to the injured. Clara Whitmore was removed from the chapel house before the parish woke fully. Within days, she was sent away from St. Martin Parish. Her shame had been managed. Her family's name remained mostly intact. Months later, a boy associated with the Mercer line began appearing in records in a way that made the dates look neat enough for polite society. Neat dates are often the first sign of a dirty history. Dinah was expected to return to service. She did return physically. That is what enslaved people were forced to do. But something had been fixed in her memory with a precision no threat could erase. The mark behind the left ear, the strength of the cry, the face she had held in blood and stormlight for those few stolen minutes. People like Father Elias Vane count on time to do their work for them. They trust years to soften outrage, death to remove witnesses, and social rank to turn lies into accepted memory. Sometimes they succeed. Often they succeed for far too long. But memory has its own discipline, and on April 3, 1839, inside a chapel built to speak of salvation, men chose instead to manufacture a false child, a false record, and a false peace. They did it under a cross. They did it while one mother bled and another family calculated. They did it because, in that world, a black woman's claim to her own child was treated as weaker than a white house's claim to respectability. That is not just scandal, that is indictment. And 19 years later, when Dinah Reed walked back into St. Bartholomew Chapel and looked at Julian Mercer's face, she was not guessing. She was identifying the living proof of what had been stolen before dawn in the spring of 1839. Once Dinah Reed spoke the words inside St. Bartholomew Chapel on September 14, 1858, the ceremony did not collapse at once. That is not how powerful families fail. They do not shatter immediately. They tighten. They deny. They look to the nearest man in authority and wait for him to smother the truth before it can take legal shape. That man again was Father Elias Vane. He stepped down from the altar with the speed of someone protecting more than decorum. He ordered the ushers to remove Dinah Reed from the chapel. He told the guests the woman was disturbed and driven by old resentments. He told Eleanor Ashcroft to remain calm. He told Julian Mercer to hold his place. He tried to preserve the frame. That should be recorded exactly as it happened. When truth entered the room, Father Vane's instinct was not examination, it was containment. But a spoken accusation has a life of its own, once enough ears hear it. By then, the guests had already begun whispering the one question no one wanted asked aloud. If Dinah Reed was right, then who exactly was Julian Mercer? Not whose son by upbringing, not whose heir in the ledger, but whose blood. That distinction mattered more in Louisiana in 1858 than any sermon could wash clean. Blood determined inheritance. Blood determined legitimacy. Blood determined whether a marriage joined two families or exposed one, and in plantation society, blood was treated as sacred only when wealth depended on it. Men who had no difficulty violating black women suddenly became obsessed with lineage when land titles were involved. Julian Mercer had been raised under the name of Edmund Mercer, one of the largest sugarmen along the Upper River Road. In formal records, he appeared to be Mercer's lawful son and the expected heir to a shrinking but still valuable estate. The problem was not that the record existed. The problem was that the dates and faces never sat as comfortably together as the parish pretended. Even before Dinah returned, there had been quiet observations over the years. Old servants noticed them first, as servants always do. They saw who resembled whom because they were made to watch the household more closely than the household ever watched itself. Some said Julian had Edmund Mercer's height but not his expression. Others said the line of the jaw belonged elsewhere. A former Ashcroft driver, Moses Kane, had once remarked in 1853 that the young man looked more chapel-born than Mercer-bred. For that comment he was beaten and transferred to field work within the week. That too should be remembered. In slave country, even resemblance could be dangerous if it pointed toward the wrong father. Dinah Reed's accusation did not create suspicion from nothing. It gave language to what had long been managed through fear. Standing at the altar that morning, Julian Mercer was 21 years old, well-spoken, educated enough to handle contracts, trained in the manner of a white heir. He had spent most of his youth believing himself the legitimate continuation of the Mercer line. That belief was not a moral failing on his part. A stolen child does not author the theft, but once the accusation surfaced, his identity could no longer be protected by polish. Dinah was precise, and precision is what frightened them. She did not shout vague curses. She named April 3, 1839. She named the chapel house. She named the mark behind the left ear. She said the young man at the altar had her son's face and Colonel Ashcroft's mouth. That detail mattered. She did not merely deny the Mercer name. She redirected the bloodline toward Colonel Nathaniel Ashcroft, dead since January 1856, but still powerful through the estate he left behind. If Julian carried Ashcroft blood through Dinah, then the wedding in that chapel was no longer a simple union between rival houses. It was something much darker, a transaction arranged inside a hidden kinship. And Eleanor Ashcroft, the bride, stood in the center of it without warning. She was the lawful daughter of Colonel Nathaniel Ashcroft and his late wife Margaret Ashcroft, born in July 1839, just 3 months after the storm night birth Dinah described. She had been raised to protect the family name, never realizing that the man chosen for her husband might carry her father's blood through another woman. This is what greed does. It does not merely lie. It recruits the innocent into its architecture. Julian turned toward Dinah and asked, by one witness account, only 4 words. "What are you saying, woman?" A revealing question, not "Who are you?" not "Are you mistaken?" but "What are you saying?" Because some truths are felt before they are understood. Julian Mercer may not have known the story, but he had likely lived with fragments of it all his life. Men raised inside false identities often sense the edges first. Silences around their birth, missing dates, older relatives changing the subject, looks exchanged over parish records, sudden anger when they ask simple questions. In Julian's case, the record itself was awkward. His listed birth date had shifted in copies of parish and family entries between April 1839 and May 1839, and the earliest surviving notation did not bear the clean signature expected from that period. Those details had never reached public scandal because the Mercer and Ashcroft circles were both invested in not examining them. Plantation elites frequently preferred contradiction over exposure, as long as the contradiction could still be carried by social power. There was also the problem of physical resemblance to Colonel Ashcroft. Nathaniel Ashcroft had been a broad-shouldered man with a severe brow, narrow lips, and a habit of staring without warmth. The same traits appeared in Julian with increasing clarity as he matured. Guests who saw the young man beside old Ashcroft portraits in 1857 had reportedly joked, too softly to be repeated openly, that Mercer blood has learned Ashcroft manners. Jokes are often cowardly rehearsals for truths nobody dares state plainly. Dinah stated it plainly. That was why the room shifted. Not because a black woman had spoken. Women like Dinah had spoken many truths over the years and been ignored. The shift came because she attached blood, date, and body together in a way that respectable people could not fully dismiss. The same guests who would have laughed at an enslaved woman's grief now began calculating what her claim could do to title, inheritance, and marriage legitimacy. That is another ugly lesson from slave society. Many who will not care about injustice will still care about paperwork. Father Elias Vane sensed that immediately. He declared that no such accusation could be accepted without evidence, a convenient principle given that he himself had presided over the records likely used to bury the evidence. Men who manipulate documents often become very solemn about procedure once the documents begin to threaten them. Dinah answered him with the kind of truth the powerful hate most: remembered truth. She said she did not need his permission to recognize her own child. She said she remembered the ear, the eyes, the timing, the storm, the room, the theft. She said that if the chapel wanted records, then let the parish books be opened in front of witnesses. At that, Father Vane lost what remained of his composure. That reaction deserves more weight than any speech he gave that day. Because innocence welcomes inspection, corruption delays it. Among the Ashcroft guests, Mr. Silas Wren, the bride's maternal uncle and acting advisor to the estate, tried to step in with the language of insult. He called Dinah a diseased old liar. He said she had been gone too long to know what she claimed. He said no Negro woman would be allowed to blacken a family wedding with delirium. That statement, ugly as it was, revealed the full reflex of the class gathered there, not to refute with fact, but to discredit by race. When evidence threatens white profit, racism is often the first weapon drawn and the last surrendered. But one fact could not be shouted down. If Julian Mercer was not Edmund Mercer's son, then he was something else. And if he was Nathaniel Ashcroft's son through Dinah Reed, then Eleanor Ashcroft was not marrying an outsider at all. She was standing before her own father's other child, a half-brother. The horror of that was not merely biological. It was moral, legal, and deliberate. It meant the proposed marriage was not the accidental crossing of unknown histories. It was a structure built atop concealed paternity. It meant the old dispute between Ashcroft and Mercer property lines might be resolved by joining assets that had, in truth, already passed through the same man's blood. It meant someone had understood enough of the lineage to exploit it. And that is where the accusation against Father Elias Vane began to deepen. Because he was not some newly arrived priest ignorant of the families involved. He had been present in 1839. He had remained at St. Bartholomew for nearly 20 years. He had officiated funerals, handled baptisms, heard confessions, and reviewed parish books. He knew when children were born, when women disappeared, when names changed, when estates shifted. He knew the Ashcroft rivalry with the Mercers. He knew that by 1858 both houses were under strain from legal costs and fluctuating yields. He also knew that Eleanor Ashcroft's marriage to Julian Mercer had been discussed not as romance, but as settlement. So when he tried to frame Dinah's accusation as sudden madness, the effort rang false to anyone paying attention. Julian himself began to show it. He was no longer standing in the proud stillness of a groom awaiting blessing. He looked from Dinah to Father Vane, then to the Ashcroft pews, then back to Eleanor. Those movements told their own story. He was searching the room not for comfort but for contradiction, and finding too much silence. Silence is often the first confession available in polite company. Eleanor saw it as well. Witnesses later said her hands trembled so hard she nearly dropped her gloves. She asked Father Vane in a low but audible voice whether he knew this woman. He answered yes, but only as a former servant from the Ashcroft property. He did not answer whether he knew the story she was telling. That omission was not accidental. It was tactical. A guilty man survives one question by answering a smaller one. But the chapel had already begun to divide. Some guests urged the ceremony be postponed. A few demanded Dinah be arrested. Others, more cautious, wanted the books examined before any vow was spoken. Even among slaveholding elites, there remained one fear stronger than scandal: public invalidity. A marriage tainted by forbidden kinship could unravel not just reputation, but contracts, dowry arrangements, succession claims, and land mergers. Suddenly the holy union looked less like a blessing and more like a lawsuit waiting to happen. That is when the core truth of Julian Mercer's identity emerged from beneath the clothing, the name, and the expectation. He was no longer secure as Mercer by assumption. He was a contested son, a young white man raised in privilege, yes, but possibly born out of rape, theft, and record tampering in a chapel that had served wealth more faithfully than God. That contradiction is central to the case. Slave society did not merely brutalize black mothers. It also manufactured false white heirs when convenient, then demanded everyone around them perform certainty. Julian Mercer was one such performance, and Dinah Reed, standing old and worn in the aisle of St. Bartholomew, had just torn the script in half. Remember this carefully. Names given by power are not always names earned by truth. A ledger can lie, a priest can lie, a family can lie for 20 years and call it order, but blood, timing, and panic tend to expose what paper tries to protect. By the time the wedding halted fully that afternoon, one fact had become impossible to bury again. The groom was no simple Mercer heir entering the Ashcroft line. He was almost certainly the hidden son of Colonel Nathaniel Ashcroft, the bride's father, and the living proof that the marriage at St. Bartholomew had placed a sister and her half-brother before the altar, while the priest who blessed them pretended not to know. The scandal at St. Bartholomew Chapel did not turn on ignorance. It turned on intent. That must be stated clearly, because men like Father Elias Vane survive by being described as weak, misled, or trapped by circumstance. He was none of those things. By September 1858, he was 56 years old, nearly 2 decades into his post in St. Martin Parish, Louisiana, and deeply woven into the private affairs of the region's wealthiest families. He had baptized their children, buried their dead, witnessed their contracts, and heard the confessions they thought could purchase relief without consequence. He knew the histories of the Ashcrofts and the Mercers better than many blood relatives did. He knew their debts, he knew their quarrels. He knew which names appeared in the pews every Sunday and which names disappeared quietly from household lists after a sale, a pregnancy, or a beating. There was nothing accidental in his position. So when Dinah Reed named the stolen child in the middle of the wedding ceremony, the real question was never whether Father Vane recognized her. The question was how long he had been protecting the arrangement. The answer, by every meaningful measure, was from the beginning. He had been present on April 3, 1839, inside the chapel house, when Dinah Reed gave birth during the storm. He had remained in the parish when the records were altered. He had watched the years pass as Julian Mercer grew into the face of a man who should never have been named Mercer at all. And he had stood by as Eleanor Ashcroft, lawful daughter of Colonel Nathaniel Ashcroft, was prepared for a marriage that would erase the last open dispute between two estates already tied together by hidden blood. That is not negligence. That is management. And what exactly was being managed? Money, land, labor, lawsuits, public image. Those are the true sacraments of men who use religion as a curtain. By the middle of the 1850s, both the Ashcroft and Mercer houses were under pressure. The old prosperity still existed in the form of acreage, enslaved labor, and machinery, but the confidence was thinning. Sugar prices had been unstable after bad seasons. Flood damage along the lower fields in 1855 had weakened the Mercer returns. The Ashcroft estate, after Colonel Nathaniel's death in January 1856, entered a period of legal uncertainty. His legitimate holdings passed under the protection of trustees acting for Eleanor Ashcroft, who was not yet fully independent in practice despite her age. At the same time, several boundary disputes between Ashcroft and Mercer lands, especially along the marsh tracts west of Bayou Teche, had remained unresolved since at least 1846. Those disputes were expensive. Surveyors, lawyers, and temporary injunctions devoured money while the cane still had to be cut and the labor still had to be forced from exhausted bodies. This is what respectable society called conflict, but beneath it sat a simpler truth. Two white families were fighting over profits extracted from black people, and they were growing tired of paying the legal bill. A marriage offered a solution. That solution did not need love. It needed signatures, inheritance rights, and the appearance of harmony. Eleanor Ashcroft, 19 in 1858, represented lawful title, family continuity, and social legitimacy. Julian Mercer, 21, represented access to the Mercer claim and the possibility of ending the contested boundaries through union rather than litigation. If the two married, dowry structures and consolidated management could turn old fights into one enlarged estate. Less courtroom cost, more stable credit, fewer public fractures. The chapel would call it reconciliation. The planters would call it prudent. In plain words, it was the merging of wealth through controlled bloodlines. And Father Elias Vane helped design it, not in the crude sense of drafting every legal page. Men like him are too careful to leave fingerprints in the obvious places. His role was more valuable. He made the merger feel moral. He softened objections. He spoke of peace between families. He reminded widowed relatives that bitterness damaged the community. He framed the match as a Christian restoration of order after years of unnecessary hostility. This is how a polished priest serves greed best, not by shouting commands, but by giving appetite a respectable vocabulary. There were meetings, not rumors. Meetings. In November 1857, Father Vane reportedly took supper twice within 10 days at the Ashcroft house with Silas Wren, Eleanor's maternal uncle and practical guardian of the estate's immediate interests. In December 1857, he was seen arriving at Mercer Landing after dusk, where Edmund Mercer and his attorney Gideon Pike were already discussing claims related to the Lower Cane fields. By February 1858, local talk had shifted from possible settlement to promising union. That language did not appear from nowhere. It was cultivated, it was prepared, and no one in that circle was better placed than Father Vane to know the hidden obscenity inside the plan. Because he knew Julian Mercer was almost certainly not Edmund Mercer's natural son. He knew the parish records from 1839 were compromised. He knew Dinah Reed had given birth to a healthy boy under chapel supervision. He knew another infant from a white family had entered the building that same night under conditions designed for secrecy. He knew what was written afterward did not match what had happened before dawn. And if he had somehow failed to understand the full theft in 1839, he had nearly 20 years to observe the consequences. Julian's resemblance to Nathaniel Ashcroft, the unnatural handling of his birth dates, the absolute refusal to revisit the chapel records openly, and the convenient disappearance of witnesses. That accumulation matters. A single lie might be explained away by fear. 20 years of protected falsehood becomes policy. It is also necessary to say this plainly. Father Vane was not trying to prevent sin. He was redistributing it. He did not expose Colonel Nathaniel Ashcroft for using Dinah Reed. He did not defend Dinah's child. He did not correct the record when Julian was raised under a false line. He did not protect Eleanor from a forbidden marriage. At each stage, he placed institutional quiet above human truth. He chose what would preserve household alliances, preserve his standing with the wealthy, preserve the illusion that St. Bartholomew Chapel remained a site of moral authority instead of a storehouse for manipulated records and buried crimes. Men sometimes imagine that evil is measured only by the violence they commit directly. That is a comforting lie. There is another class of evil, the administrative kind, the kind that signs, arranges, delays, blesses, and rationalizes, the kind that washes its hands because others perform the dirtier motions. Father Elias Vane belonged to that class. He was not the first priest to stand between sin and justice and decide that sin was more useful. By the spring of 1858, the marriage negotiations had advanced far enough that details of Eleanor's dowry and post-marital residence were already being discussed. Mercer representatives favored a seasonal split between the upriver property and the Ashcroft house until the legal merger of disputed tracts could be completed. Ashcroft advisors wanted stronger guarantees that Eleanor's title would not be diluted by Mercer debt. Those disagreements were practical, not moral. Not one of the men in those conversations appears to have raised the central question. Should this marriage happen at all if the bloodline is compromised? Why was that question missing? Because Father Vane was the one man who could have raised it with full authority, and he refused. That refusal is more damning than any shouted insult from the pews on the wedding day. A drunken uncle can sneer, a lawyer can scheme, a planter can calculate, but a priest who knows and still blesses has crossed into deliberate corruption. He has transformed private vice into public endorsement. There were warning signs, even before Dinah returned. A former chapel clerk, Thomas Bell, nephew of the midwife Hester Bell, reportedly told a cousin in 1854 that certain earlier parish books had pages rebound in newer thread, and that one April register carried entries too neat for storm work. He left the parish the next year. A housemaid at the Ashcroft estate later recalled that Father Vane once became visibly angry when Eleanor, then about 15, remarked that Julian Mercer looked strangely like a younger portrait of her father. She thought she had made an innocent observation. He told her sharply not to repeat childish nonsense. Children often see what adults have already agreed not to say. There is a pattern here, and patterns deserve discipline. First came the violation of Dinah Reed, then the birth concealed in the chapel house, then the record altered, then the boy placed under a false name, then the witnesses thinned out, sold away, buried, intimidated, or absorbed into silence. Then, when money grew tight, the same hidden bloodline was used again, this time as a bridge between disputed estates. That is what makes Father Vane's role so ugly. He did not merely cover one crime in 1839. He kept the crime alive because it later became useful. Useful for whom? Not Dinah, not Eleanor, not Julian, even if he had benefited materially from the lie. The true beneficiaries were the men who wanted stable titles, consolidated acreage, disciplined labor, and the continued illusion that white society could sort its own corruption quietly behind church doors. On the wedding day itself, Father Vane's behavior confirmed everything. When Dinah spoke, he did not ask for patience or investigation in the interest of justice. He moved instantly to removal, humiliation, and suppression. He called her words blasphemy because truth was the only thing in that room capable of profaning the arrangement he had helped build. He feared interruption more than incest. He feared scandal more than sacrilege. That is the measure of him. And let no one excuse him by saying that the times were cruel and he was a man of his century. The century was cruel because too many men like him kept choosing advantage over witness. History is not some weather passing over innocent people. It is constructed, reinforced, and defended by decisions. Father Elias Vane made his. By September 14, 1858, he had enough knowledge to stop the marriage before the guests ever arrived. He could have refused to officiate. He could have demanded a private inquiry into the records. He could have warned Eleanor. He could have forced the Ashcroft and Mercer houses to face the contamination at the center of their settlement. He did none of it. Instead, he prepared the altar. He polished the ceremony. He put sacred language around a transaction built on disputed paternity, racial exploitation, falsified records, and concealed kinship. This is why the wedding at St. Bartholomew was never simply a family scandal. It was an indictment of the whole structure that allowed a priest to become broker, witness, and accomplice in the same breath. A structure in which black suffering could be buried, white legitimacy could be manufactured, and the church could be used not to expose sin but to stabilize its profits. Remember the difference. Some men protect the innocent. Others protect the institution that feeds on them. Father Elias Vane did not protect the innocent. He protected the estates. Dinah Reed did not return to St. Bartholomew Chapel by accident. She returned because silence had finally become more unbearable than punishment. By the time she walked into that wedding on September 14, 1858, she was an old woman by the standards slavery imposed. Not old in years alone, though she was likely in her early 40s, but old in the harsher sense, worn down by sale, transport, field labor, fever seasons, and the long discipline of surviving with memory intact. Men like Father Elias Vane and Silas Wren saw only a bent black woman in a faded dress. They mistook damage for weakness. Cruel systems often make that mistake. They assume that if a person has been ground down long enough, she will forget what was taken from her. But memory, especially a mother's memory, does not obey the comfort of the powerful. Dinah had been removed from the Ashcroft world in 1842. The timing was not random. It came 3 years after the storm night birth in the chapel house and not long after she had begun, according to later accounts, asking too many direct questions about the child she was told had died. That alone marks the motive. Plantation households did not sell valuable domestic labor lightly if they sold a woman who knew the household's rhythms, its locked rooms, its private humiliations. They usually did so for one reason. She had become dangerous to keep nearby. The transaction was entered in an estate book under cold language. Female servant transferred south with 2 others for household consolidation. That phrase deserves contempt. There was no consolidation. There was disposal. She was first sent to Calcasieu Parish under the control of Benoit Larocque, a cane planter with a reputation for punishing insubordinate women by assigning them to ditch clearing and night work. From there, around 1847, After a season of sickness reduced his labor force, Dinah was sold again westward to a smaller holding near the Texas line. The distances matter because they explain why she vanished from St. Martin Parish for so long. She was not free to return. She was pushed farther from the place of the theft precisely so her testimony would weaken with geography and time. That was the calculation. What the calculation failed to account for was endurance. Over the years, Dinah carried the same fixed points. April 3, 1839. The storm, the chapel house, the mark behind the left ear, the face of Father Elias Vane hovering near the bed while pretending sanctity. The knowledge that the child they said was dead had not died in her arms. That is what sustained the accusation. Not rumor passed among laborers, not bitterness without shape, a set of details repeated across 19 years until they became sharper than the lies built against them. There is a moral fact here worth recording. Power counts on the poor to lose sequence. It hopes hunger, sale, and humiliation will blur dates and weaken names. That is why the powerful are often so frightened when the poor speak clearly. Precision breaks the spell. Sometime in late August 1858, Dinah came back into St. Martin Parish. The exact route remains uncertain, but several later statements place her first near the old ferry crossing east of Bayou Teche, traveling on foot with a wagon train before breaking away toward the chapel lands. She had likely heard of the upcoming marriage while passing through plantation roads or church outbuildings, where news traveled in fragments among enslaved people faster than masters realized. Weddings of powerful families were never private to those forced to service them. The sewing women heard first, then the carriage boys, then the cooks, then the field hands who noticed when extra livestock was butchered and chapel silver was polished. By the time a rich family called an event respectable, the enslaved already knew its schedule. That is almost certainly how Dinah learned the names, Eleanor Ashcroft and Julian Mercer, and the second name would have struck like a blade. Julian Mercer was no longer an infant hidden in linens. By 1858 he was known throughout the parish as a rising heir, educated, measured, and favored in negotiations. But Dinah did not need the language of inheritance. She needed only one look. When she saw the face, the years collapsed. That is what happened in the chapel, not madness. Recognition. Before she entered that wedding, there are signs she made at least one effort to speak privately. An elderly sexton, Peter Goff, later said a black woman had approached the chapel grounds 2 days before the ceremony, asking whether Father Vane still kept the old parish books locked in the rear cabinet. He drove her off. If that was Dinah, and the description strongly suggests it was, then her first instinct was not public disruption, but verification. She wanted the record confronted before the vows were spoken. That detail matters because it strips away the lazy accusation that she came only to create spectacle. She came because the spectacle had already been arranged by others, and she was trying to stop it. No one listened, so she entered the church. What happened then was ugly, but not surprising. Once Dinah named the theft, the room reacted as rooms like that always react, through race, not truth. Silas Wren spat contempt first. 2 ushers moved toward her before anyone asked for facts. A planter near the third pew reportedly called for the sheriff. One woman covered Eleanor's ears as if the greater obscenity were the words being spoken, not the bloodline being exposed. This is the instinct of corrupt society. It treats revelation as contamination, and the original crime as old business best left buried. But Dinah kept speaking. She said the groom was born in the chapel house in April 1839. She said she had held him. She said the priest knew. She said they had stolen one child and dressed the theft in church silence. These were not vague attacks. They were assertions structured like evidence. Date, place, witness, method. That is why Father Vane panicked. He was not facing grief. He was facing testimony. The wedding stopped being a ceremony at that moment. It became a site of competing records. And Dinah Reed, who in the eyes of that society should have counted for nothing, became the most dangerous person in the parish. Not because she had wealth, not because she had rank, but because she had continuity. Continuity is what crimes fear most. A scandal can be dismissed as noise. A consistent witness, returning after 19 years with the same names and the same night fixed in memory, is harder to break. That is what made Dinah different from the gossips and whisperers who had circled the case before. She was not adding another rumor. She was reopening an event. It is important here to remember what slavery tried to do to women like her. It did not merely exploit their labor. It tried to sever their authority over truth itself. An enslaved mother could give birth and still be denied the right to name her own child, keep her own child, bury her own child, or even testify honestly about whether that child lived. The system was designed to reduce black motherhood to biological function while reserving social legitimacy for white households. Dinah's return was therefore not only personal, it was a direct attack on the racial order of evidence. She was saying, I remember, I identify, I accuse. That is why the reaction became so vicious, so quickly. According to later recollections, Father Elias Vane called her claims the feverish inventions of age. Silas Wren called her a sold-off liar dragged back by spite. One guest demanded she be whipped off the property. Consider the sequence. She names a child theft and an incestuous marriage. The response is not inquiry, it is proposed violence against the witness. Nothing exposes guilt more clearly than the eagerness to punish before proving. Dinah did not retreat under that pressure. She turned toward Eleanor Ashcroft herself. That was the cruelest and most necessary turn of all, because until then, the men in the room could still pretend they were managing a disturbance. Once Dinah addressed the bride, the matter became flesh. She reportedly said, "Miss, ask them whose son he is." A simple sentence, but it shattered the comfort of abstraction. Suddenly, Eleanor was no longer a daughter in satin waiting for a ritual. She was a young woman being forced to stand inside a question her family and priest had hidden from her. Was the man at the altar her father's other child? No sermon, no veil, no polished silver could soften that. Julian Mercer, for his part, seems to have been shaken into partial stillness. That is the phrase several witnesses later implied without using directly. He did not lunge at Dinah, he did not laugh. He stared, then looked toward Father Vane as if waiting for a denial strong enough to erase what he had just heard. He did not get one. He got authority, indignation, and delay, but not clarity. Guilty rooms often produce a very particular silence, one in which everyone speaks except the one fact that would end confusion. Dinah knew what that silence meant. This is another reason she had come back. Not merely to accuse the priest, but to force the parish to hear how the lie sounded when spoken in public. A private wrong can be managed. A public accusation enters memory differently. Even if the powerful regroup, even if the witness is later discredited, the event remains. From that morning on, nobody in St. Bartholomew could say the wedding proceeded in innocence. They had heard the charge. They had watched the priest refuse a clean answer. They had seen the bride tremble and the groom go pale. That is how a buried crime becomes evidence, not only through documents, but through the panic it produces when named aloud. Dinah Reed came back to do exactly that. There is courage, and then there is this harsher form of courage, the return of a person whom the system already tried to erase. She had every reason to stay gone. The law would not protect her. The church would not welcome her. The Ashcrofts would not spare her. Her body had already paid for too much truth, and yet she came, not with soldiers, not with a lawyer, not with a letter from any official hand. She came with memory, with dates, with a face recognized across 19 years. That is why her return matters beyond family scandal. It is an active witness against the whole plantation method of forgetting. Rich houses built their security on the assumption that black suffering left no admissible archive. Dinah walked back in and proved otherwise. She was the archive. By the end of that ruined ceremony, the chapel was no longer a place of blessing. It had become, as she intended, a place of evidence. The old theft was no longer hidden in the storm of 1839. It had a voice in 1858. It had a witness standing in plain sight, and every polished lie in that parish now had to reckon with the one woman they had sold away because they believed distance would do what conscience never had. They were wrong. Dinah Reed came back to name the crime, and once she did, the wedding was no longer a family celebration. It was evidence. Once Dinah Reed spoke in St. Bartholomew Chapel on September 14, 1858, memory alone was enough to stop the wedding. But memory was not the only thing waiting in that parish. There were records. Damaged, hidden, altered, but still there. And records, when they refuse to die completely, become the most dangerous enemies of men who built their power on careful omission. The first weakness in the lie was the parish register. St. Bartholomew kept its birth and baptism records in a locked walnut cabinet behind the vestry wall, a cabinet Father Elias Vane had controlled for nearly 20 years. The books were not public in any meaningful sense. Wealthy families could consult them when it served inheritance or legitimacy. Poor families rarely saw them at all. Enslaved people saw them least of all. even when the entries involved their own children. That was the pattern across slave country. The law demanded documentation, but power decided who was allowed to touch it. After the wedding was halted, pressure rose from multiple sides. Not moral pressure first, but legal pressure. That distinction matters. Men who had ignored Dinah Reed's suffering for 19 years suddenly became very interested in evidence once land titles and marriage validity were threatened. Silas Wren wanted the accusation crushed quickly. Edmund Mercer wanted the register examined discreetly before public gossip reached New Orleans attorneys. A few parish men, fearful of being tied to open scandal, demanded a private review of the old entries. And Father Vane, who had once relied on secrecy, now had to pretend that secrecy itself was a form of order. The register for April 1839 should have settled matters cleanly if it had been honest. It was not. The page covering the week of April 1st through April 7th, 1839 showed visible tampering even to untrained eyes. The stitching along that section was newer than the surrounding binding. One line had been scraped and overwritten. Ink tone changed between adjacent entries. A margin note that should have been initialed in the same hand as the rest instead carried a cramped correction added later. That is how deceit often survives on paper, not flawlessly, but just well enough to intimidate people who do not wish to challenge it. The entry tied to Julian Mercer was especially suspicious. It gave a date inconsistent with the Storm Night account and used wording too polished for an emergency birth and chapel custody. Worse, the line referred indirectly to a private infant presentation connected to a traveling relation of the Mercer line, without naming the mother clearly. Such vagueness was not normal for standard parish notations. Vagueness enters records when precision would expose someone important. Then there was the missing name. No straightforward entry acknowledged Dinah Reed's labor that same night. For an enslaved woman on Ashcroft property, that omission was possible, even common. Black births were often recorded carelessly or not at all unless property accounting required it. But the absence itself became evidence once paired with her testimony and the altered line in the register. A hidden birth beside a suspiciously rewritten entry is not coincidence. It is structure. Still, the register alone was not enough, because paper can be challenged, but patterns are harder to dismiss. The second weakness in the lie came from Hester Bell, the midwife who had been in the chapel house on April 3, 1839. By 1858, Hester Bell was dead. She had passed in February 1857, buried quietly with little notice beyond the families she had served. Dead women often leave behind more truth than living institutions. In her case, that truth did not come as a public confession. It came in fragments. One remembered conversation, one folded note, one nephew who understood too late what he had been asked to keep. That nephew was Thomas Bell, formerly a chapel clerk and later a copyist near New Iberia. He had heard Dinah's accusation at second hand within days of the failed wedding and returned to St. Martin Parish, carrying something he had kept since his aunt's final illness. It was not a polished affidavit. It was not even a complete narrative. It was a short, stained page tucked into a prayer manual Hester had left among her things. On it, in broken lines and uneven hand, were references to 2 boys, Storm Night, the wrong mother told, and one sentence that mattered more than the rest. The stronger child was not left where first he came. That sentence did not name Julian Mercer. It did not name Dinah. But it did exactly what false systems fear. It confirmed method. A child had been moved, the stronger child, not left where first he came. No one writes a line like that by accident. Thomas Bell also repeated something his aunt had told him during her last fever in January 1857. She said she had watched a priest save a family and damn a mother. That phrase deserves to be kept intact because it cut through every respectable excuse. Hester Bell did not describe confusion. She described choice. A priest. A family. A mother sacrificed to preserve the first 2. Then came the third weakness, Colonel Nathaniel Ashcroft's movements. For years, plantation men moved through the parish as though their travel proved nothing. But in inheritance disputes, movements matter. Carriage logs, household books, chapel offerings, guest meal notes, small records become witnesses when men are too arrogant to imagine anyone will ever compare them. In this case, the dates placed Colonel Nathaniel Ashcroft near St. Bartholomew repeatedly in the final days before April 3, 1839. One stable note from the Ashcroft property marked a horse lamed on the chapel road on March 31st. A kitchen account at the church listed a late-night tray sent to the rear house on April 2nd. A household servant later recalled Dinah being removed from regular duties that same week and kept out of sight. None of this proved paternity on its own. Together, it tightened the pattern around Ashcroft with uncomfortable precision. And then there was the face. People dismiss resemblance until resemblance begins affecting contracts. Then suddenly everyone becomes an expert observer. Once the marriage stopped, old Ashcroft portraits were looked at with new eyes. The one hanging in the Ashcroft study, painted in 1834, showed Nathaniel Ashcroft at 41. Severe brow, thin lips, narrow cheek structure, a slight angle at the left ear. Julian Mercer, standing under chapel light in 1858, carried those same features more clearly than any Mercer heir should have. This was not proof in a courtroom sense. But it was proof in the older, more devastating sense. Proof of what generations of servants, maids, drivers, and kin had seen and been told not to name. The fourth weakness was the one Father Elias Vane feared most: chronology. Chronology punishes liars because time is less flexible than rhetoric. The chain now looked like this: Dinah Reed pregnant on Ashcroft property in early 1839. A storm night labor in the chapel house on April 3, 1839. Another white mother brought in secretly under family protection. An altered register. A child thereafter associated with the Mercer line. Dinah told her child was dead without convincing witness. Dinah sold away in 1842. Julian Mercer raised in privilege while the priest kept the books. Eleanor Ashcroft, born lawful daughter in July 1839, growing up unaware. Marriage negotiations beginning in late 1857. Wedding halted in September 1858 by the one surviving mother who recognized the groom. That is not a rumor chain. That is a prosecutable sequence. And at the center of it stood the father, no one wanted named plainly, Colonel Nathaniel Ashcroft. By then he was safely dead, which is often how patriarchy prefers its guilty men, beyond cross-examination, still defended by their estates. But death does not clean evidence. Nathaniel Ashcroft had motive, access, and pattern. He had used Dinah Reed. He had reason to prevent a living child of that union from remaining visible under her claim. He had reason to cooperate in silence if another family needed a discreet infant history repaired. He had reason, above all, to trust Father Vane to keep order where scandal might otherwise spread. Men of his class did not need to write confessions. They operated through the confidence that everyone beneath them understood the arrangement. That arrangement was now breaking. What made it worse in moral terms, not only legal ones, was the identity of the proposed bride. Eleanor Ashcroft was not some distant cousin caught in an unfortunate uncertainty. She was Nathaniel's lawful daughter, the cherished vessel of family legitimacy, the one whose marriage had been groomed to stabilize the estate. If Julian Mercer was Nathaniel's son through Dinah Reed, then the plan set before the altar was not merely dishonest. It was blood joining blood under a false name for the sake of property. Half-siblings joined by design. Those words matter. By design. Because once the register, the midwife's note, the timing, and the resemblance aligned, accident became impossible to maintain. The church could no longer hide behind ignorance. The families could no longer pretend they were only unlucky. Someone had built this path and kept it swept. That is when the phrase began to circulate quietly among those too frightened to say it aloud in public. The altar was being used to finish what the chapel house had begun. A stolen child in 1839, a falsified heir in the years after. A marriage in 1858 meant to merge disputed fortunes through that same hidden line. The entire structure of the crime became visible at once. Not every detail perhaps, but enough. Enough to reveal that St. Bartholomew was not simply the place where truth was buried. It was the place where truth had been processed, renamed, and then recycled for profit. Remember what this means. Slavery did not only brutalize bodies in the field, it also trained institutions to manipulate kinship itself. It taught churches to sanctify silence, planters to weaponize legitimacy, and record keepers to treat black motherhood as removable when white inheritance required it. That is why this scandal is not small. It is a window into method. By the final days of September 1858, no serious observer could claim the evidence pointed anywhere else. The register was compromised. The midwife's surviving note confirmed a stronger child had been moved. Nathaniel Ashcroft's presence near the chapel aligned with Dinah's account. Julian Mercer's age, features, and unstable birth record matched the theft. Eleanor's position as lawful daughter made the proposed marriage intolerable. Father Vane's panic completed the picture. Innocent men do not fear the opening of books they kept themselves. The records had spoken, even through damage. The dead midwife had spoken, even through a scrap of paper. Time had spoken, even after 19 years of coercion, and the father no one dared name while he lived now stood in full outline over the case. The man whose power over a black woman helped produce a son he would never publicly claim, and whose hidden bloodline was later used by church and family alike to settle property disputes under the disguise of marriage. This is how corruption matures. It begins as violation, it hardens into paperwork, it survives as custom. And when money tightens, it returns in a new form, asking the altar to do what the lie alone can no longer finish. By then the truth was no longer a single accusation from Dinah Reed. It was a pattern too complete to dismiss. Eleanor Ashcroft and Julian Mercer were not strangers joined by convenience. They were half-siblings joined by design. And above them, as he had always been, stood Father Elias Vane, keeper of the books, steward of the silence, hoping the altar would hide what the chapel first created. Whether the ceremony at St. Bartholomew Chapel was formally completed or broken apart before the final vow no longer mattered by the end of September 14, 1858. The true damage had already been done. Not to a wedding day, not to a family's pride, to the lie itself. Once Dinah Reed named the theft, once the parish register showed signs of tampering, once the dead midwife's note surfaced, once Eleanor Ashcroft and Julian Mercer stood under the same chapel roof with their father's shadow hanging over them both, the old arrangement could not be repaired. It could only be delayed, denied, and punished. That is what corrupt systems do in their final stage. They do not repent. They retaliate. In the days immediately after the scandal, the Ashcroft house locked itself down. Carriages came and went at unusual hours. Curtains stayed drawn through the afternoon. Silas Wren took charge of all visitors and announced that Miss Eleanor would receive no callers beyond immediate relations. Servants were warned not to repeat what had happened in the chapel. The threat did not have to be spoken with a whip in hand. On plantations, everyone already knew what happened to black mouths that carried white secrets too far. The Mercers responded differently, but with the same intention. Edmund Mercer sent word that Julian would not appear publicly until questions of insult and slander were resolved. That phrase was deliberate. Not truth and falsehood, not record and counter-record, insult and slander. Wealthy men often try to reduce evidence to tone. If they can make revelations sound impolite, they hope society will forget to ask whether it is accurate. But this case had already moved beyond manners. Because once the accusation spread through St. Martin Parish, it touched everything the two houses had hoped to protect: inheritance, legitimacy, sacrament, and public trust. The Ashcroft name, long maintained through force and ceremony, no longer looked stable. It looked contaminated. The Mercer claim, already strained by debt and declining yield, now rested on a son whose parentage had become a matter of public dispute. And Father Elias Vane, who had spent nearly 20 years cultivating the image of a moral steward, now stood exposed as something far uglier, a man who had used the authority of the church not to prevent corruption, but to organize it. That is the proper word here, organize. He did not simply keep a secret. He administered it. He maintained it across time. He helped move it from birth record to marriage altar. That is why the scandal outlived the wedding day. People can forgive lust. They can forgive private cruelty when it remains hidden behind plantation walls. But they fear systemic corruption once it becomes visible, because systemic corruption threatens the agreements that make wealth appear lawful. What St. Bartholomew revealed was not one sin. It was a chain. A black woman violated, a child stolen, a priest altering silence into policy, a white heir manufactured, a noble daughter prepared as a bargaining tool, a wedding arranged to merge disputed property through hidden blood. Nothing in that chain was accidental. By September 18, 1858, talk of civil action had begun among the Ashcroft advisors, not against the priest at first, not against the dead father, against Dinah Reed. That also must be remembered. The first legal impulse of these families was to attack the witness. She was accused in private language of fraud, disturbance, attempted extortion, and incitement. No solid case could be built, but that was almost beside the point. The aim was intimidation. The law in slave country was often used not to prove, but to exhaust. Dinah herself reportedly disappeared from the immediate parish within days. Some said she was hidden by free black families along the lower road. Others believed she took refuge near the marsh settlements, where plantation men preferred not to ride after dark. Whether those details can be fully confirmed is less important than what they reveal. Once again, the woman who told the truth had to move as though she were the criminal. That is the old pattern. First, society steals from the vulnerable, then it punishes them for remembering accurately. Eleanor Ashcroft suffered the scandal differently. She remained within the family house, under supervision, while male relatives debated what version of events could still be salvaged. She was 19 years old and had become, in a matter of hours, the central victim of a plot built long before she was capable of resisting it. It is important not to erase her in the fury against the priest and the estates. She had been used, prepared for display, dressed for alliance, never informed of the danger at the center of her own marriage. In such households, daughters were called precious while being treated as instruments. That contradiction deserves no sentimental defense. Julian Mercer's position was more complicated, but not less tragic. If he was indeed the son of Colonel Nathaniel Ashcroft and Dinah Reed, then he had been raised inside a lie that benefited him materially while also severing him from his real mother and placing him, unknowingly, on the path to marry his own half-sister. That is the special cruelty of elite corruption. It does not merely exploit the powerless. It distorts the lives of those it falsely elevates, then leaves them to discover their identity only when the lie can no longer hold. Witnesses later suggested that Julian tried at least once in the week after the wedding to demand a direct answer from Father Vane. The priest gave him none. He spoke instead of prudence, scandal, and the danger of tearing down good order because of old confusions. There again was the language of corruption. Confusion, as though the problem were muddled memory rather than deliberate concealment. Men like Father Vane survive by turning crimes into complexities. It allows them to look burdened when they should look guilty. But guilt had already attached itself to him too firmly. His standing in the parish began to rot. Quietly at first, a skipped invitation, a tighter stare after Mass, a hesitation before greeting. The wealthy did not abandon him publicly right away because they were implicated in the same world that had fed him. But they began to treat him not as a shepherd, but as a liability. That is often how moral men should have judged him from the start. Instead, they waited until his corruption became expensive. He had, after all, failed in the one way elite society never forgives. He had let the hidden machinery become visible. By October 1858, the proposed Ashcroft-Mercer land consolidation was effectively dead. Attorneys could not cleanly proceed while questions of Julian's parentage and marriage validity remained unresolved. Creditors grew cautious. Survey matters stalled. The very outcome Father Vane had tried to secure, a stable merger of wealth, labor, and disputed title, collapsed under the weight of the truth he had tried to suppress. This is one of the few earthly judgments corruption reliably receives. It often destroys the profit it worked so hard to protect. But the deeper judgment was not financial. The deeper judgment was historical. St. Bartholomew Chapel could no longer be remembered as a neutral house of worship. Its walls had held a stolen birth, a falsified line, and an attempted marriage between half-siblings arranged for estate advantage. The Ashcroft name could no longer be spoken as though its prestige had been earned cleanly. It had been defended through racial violence, sexual coercion, and the manipulation of kinship. The Mercer name could no longer stand untouched either, because whether by active participation or convenient acceptance, that family had accepted an heir whose origins were too useful to examine, and Father Elias Vane could no longer be mistaken for a moral witness. He had been, in truth, the custodian of profitable corruption. That phrase should stay with this story, not simply corrupt, profitable corrupt, because there are many sins committed in weakness. This was not one of them. This was corruption maintained because it paid. It paid in land security. It paid in legal leverage. It paid in family reputation. It paid in the church's continued access to wealthy patrons. Even the silence around Dinah Reed's suffering had a financial logic. A black mother's loss was treated as acceptable collateral in a white settlement strategy. Remember that. Record that. Systems do not become monstrous only through hate. They also become monstrous through bookkeeping. And then there is Dinah herself. When the Ashcrofts and Mercers are long gone, when Father Vane's sermons are dust, When the polished silver from that wedding has been melted, resold, or forgotten, the figure that remains morally upright in this story is the one the parish considered least important. The woman sold away in 1842. The mother told her child was dead. The witness who walked back into St. Bartholomew in 1858 with no rank, no title, no legal shield, and still named the truth before the altar. They counted her as nothing. She became the one person who forced remembrance. That is worth saying with some moral force. In every age, corrupt institutions depend on a category of people they assume history will not record. Enslaved women, poor laborers, servants, the displaced, the sold. They imagine these people can be used, erased, and replaced without consequence. But every so often, one returns carrying the part of the record the institution tried to destroy. Dinah Reed was that record, and because she spoke, the parish was forced to confront what slavery, church power, and family greed had built together. Not a noble alliance, not a Christian reconciliation, a house founded on blood and preserved by silence. Such a house cannot stay quiet forever. Not because justice always arrives cleanly. It does not. Not because the innocent are always protected. They are not. But because lies this elaborate eventually begin to depend on too many frightened people keeping the same shape at once. One witness breaks the line. One document resurfaces. One dead midwife leaves a sentence behind. One bride asks the wrong question. One groom notices the silence. And then the whole construction begins to lean. That is what happened at St. Bartholomew in the autumn of 1858. The wedding did not end the scandal. It exposed the structure beneath it. The Ashcroft legacy was stained. The Mercer claim was broken. Father Elias Vane was unmasked. And Dinah Reed, the woman they tried to sell out of history, became the voice that forced an entire parish to remember what power, slavery, and greed were always willing to do when truth stood in the way. Subscribe and comment your location below. And tell me your theory. Did Father Elias Vane build this lie alone, or were the Ashcrofts and Mercers helping him protect it from the very beginning?